Hi, Smart Community friends. I hope you are all staying safe, well, and connected. In this episode of the Smart Community Podcast, I have a brilliant conversation with Debbie Reynolds, also known as the Data Diva. Debbie is a thought leader and advisor to multinational corporations for handling global data privacy and cyber data breach planning and response, as well as complex cross-functional management of data-centric projects. In this episode, Debbie and I talk about the divide that she saw growing up between the opportunities available in big cities like Chicago compared to nearby small towns and suburbs, and how that sparked her interest in the smart community space. Debbie shares with us the trends and considerations she sees related to the digital divide and how it plays out differently in the US compared to Europe and other places, plus why it's so important to inform citizens about data transparency, privacy, and protection issues so that they can make informed decisions. We talk about the new data privacy laws in California that came into effect in January of 2020 and the impacts Debbie expects both at an individual citizen level and big tech company level. Now, we recorded this episode in December 2019, so we talk about the California Consumer Privacy Act in future tense. But of course, in this episode, which is airing in April of 2020, the CCPA is well underway. Debbie shares with us her observations of what's happening globally as the world moves towards more data ownership at different rates in different places, and the challenges and opportunities of integrating and collaborating between disciplines, organizations, and governments, especially with regards to data breaches and ransomware incidents. We finish our chat discussing the emerging trend of the prevalence of biometric data and also of ransomware attacks on public and private organizations. As we mentioned, we are continuing with the Smart Community Podcast as normal, but I've also started Smart Com Pod updates, where I have been interviewing previous guests about how they're coping or how they're dealing with the current situation of COVID-19. Now, this is a video series that is on YouTube. We'll put a link in the show notes to some of those episodes. We've only just started, so there's a couple up there when this will air. We'd really love for you to go and check those out and let me know what you think. I wasn't going to do anything specifically related to COVID-19, but I've had lots of people reach out, and I think it's really important that we continue to share stories during this time. Okay, back to this episode. Just be aware that there are a couple of spots in the interview where the audio cuts out or, clips the end of words. However, this is such a brilliant conversation. I didn't want to re-record, even though at the time our internet connectivity wasn't the best. So forgive us for that. As always, we hope you enjoy listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
Welcome to the Smart Community, Smart Regions, Smart Towns, and Smart Cities. It's where we live, work, and play. With smart communities, the future starts today. Big data, smart mobility, emerging trends galore. The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.
Hello, Debbie. How are you today?
I'm well. Thank you, Zoe, for having me on your show.
Thanks so much for coming onto the podcast. Let's jump straight in. And can you tell us about your background and what you're passionate about?
Sure. I've been working in technology for over 20 years. I'm very interested in data flows, and that led me from working in things like university libraries to working with litigators on multinational cases worldwide. And over time, I developed a passion for data and data flows. So for me, the work that I do with Debbie Reynolds Consulting, centered around things like data privacy and cybersecurity, is a natural fit for me because I'm very interested in how people can best leverage data and not do it in a way to misuse or abuse it.
Excellent. So what sparked your interest in this smart city, smart community space?
Smart cities are interesting to me. I was born in Chicago, which is a big city, but I grew up in a smaller town that was more suburban to Chicago. And the dichotomy between the big and small city space is very different in terms of how people sort of utilize data and technology. And it was very interesting in terms of the types of opportunities that people had when I related it to data. So people who had more access to the urban environments likely had more access to data than people in more suburban or rural environments. And I see, especially with the net age and modernity, that sort of split is continuing to happen. So for me, I feel like technology is a way to level the playing field between sort of big towns and small towns in the community.
So what is a smart community to you?
Well, to me, a smart community is one that is truly leveraging the data that they have and being able to sort of utilize or develop technology that best serves the community in some way. So, let's say, 20 years ago, Neighborhood Watch was just people peeking out of the window. Maybe people now with things like Ring doorbells or being able to text each other, or even having municipalities be able to do things like using text or emails to send alerts to citizens is a way to really help leverage this type of technology and help the community in better ways.
Mm-hmm. So why do you think that this smart community concept is so important, like particularly in terms of, your area, which is data?
I think it's important because there is a digital divide, regardless of what people think. There is a have and have not only in terms of sort of money and access, but data to me equals access. So being able to make sure that everyone and anyone who wants access to, services or opportunities are able to plug into those things with data is very important. And then also, maybe 50 years ago, people were sort of living in the same places. They weren't moving around a lot, but now, especially with the digital age, people are able to sort of work from other places or work anywhere. It gives them more mobility and flexibility in how they sort of live their lives. So that type of capability or flexibility is really important to have that flow down, not just in sort of big cities or areas that are very well served and wealthy, but into all parts of the community.
Mm-hmm. That's so important. I think the digital divide is something we really need to focus on in this smart city and smart community space, because like you said, technology gives us that ability to level the playing field, but it also can have the opposite effect, which is can increase that even further, that divide, because it's all of a sudden becomes, if you don't have a smartphone or you don't understand the data, or you don't have access to that, then you'll be falling further and further behind, and the wealthy just continue to get wealthier.
Well, and nowadays, and this is something that's really interesting when you think about it, there are more smartphones on the planet than there are computers. So if people aren't making apps or making websites to services that are mobile friendly, it's possible that people who don't have access to regular computers may not be able to access those services. So things like the place where buttons are on screens, how to navigate through, all that stuff is very important. So to me, this is a pivotal point in terms of how people are using data or how they're accessing. We can't assume that everyone has a computer or even someone has a smartphone. So all those things are considerations, especially making sure that people aren't left behind, or there is such a try to bridge the gap between the haves and the have-nots.
And you talked a little bit earlier about the urban areas versus, say, regional or rural areas. What trends are you seeing in that divide? Like, is that in certain areas in particular that you see the increase happening a lot in terms of data? Like, what are some of the things we need to think about when we're talking about, say, cities and regional areas?
I think one of the big things to me in the U.S., this is very different than my experience has been in Europe, that because the U.S. is so sprawling and people are kind of clumped together in different areas, there are areas that just don't have the access to data or services and things like that. It's something as simple as in a train, or there isn't a bus to the place that you need to go. being able to sort of connect people together to be able to share rides is sort of a phenomenal concept. Of course, we see it in big cities as an alternative to cabs, but if you think about it, cabs are taxis. But if you think about it, in some of these rural areas, if you don't have a car, you may not be able to have a job. You may not be able to get where you want to go. You may not be able to pick up your children. It sort of stops your access to different things. So something as simple as having access to ride sharing has really helped people in their mobility and being able to do things like get different jobs or go to work or get their kids from daycare.
And how do you think that, like, with data and data, like privacy and protection, obviously that's a key part of your interest and your expertise. In regional communities, is there like a difference in how we understand data and data privacy, or is it just similar across the board?
I think it's very different. And I don't even think the difference is split between, cities and rural or suburban areas. I think the difference is between those who have more access to technology and those who maybe not, maybe people who use it but don't. The issue with data privacy around the world is that, there is so much that is happening with data that is not transparent to the user. If someone understood that if they downloaded a game that they like to play, that they're also agreeing in the terms and conditions to have another company sell their information or disseminate it in some other way that is maybe unnoticeable to them, or something if they understood in plain sight they would not have otherwise agreed to. So the type of transparency that's needed across the board is really important, and that's really the reason why these regulations are coming into play, and people are really looking for that transparency. I feel like people who aren't as close to the issue or understand the data flows and understand what it means to say yes to a 60-page terms and conditions contract when you use technology, they may be more aware and maybe they say, well, I understand that this company is going to use my data for X, Y, Z, and I don't care because I'm getting some advantages from it. I think being able to shine a light on what's actually happening will help people make a more informed decision about how they use apps, or if they want to have alternative ways to have the same service.
Yeah, I totally agree with the informed citizen. So I might make exactly the same decision, but it's about actually knowing what's happening, and that value exchange of data, I think, is really important.
Absolutely. I totally agree. I think one thing that concerns me, and this is something that is happening in the U.S. right now, and I'm sure it's happening especially as it relates to identity and how people sort of connect with their government and how they use systems. We have something in the U.S. called Real ID, which means that you have to go to a municipal branch of your state, the same branches that give out like driver's licenses and things like that, and you have to show them certain documentation so that you can get an ID that has a special star on it, which means if you've gone through this process, it means that you can fly on airplanes domestically and you can enter like government buildings. So people who don't have those IDs, and the thing that has been concerning me when I've seen the signs, they were like, well, if you don't go into federal buildings or you don't never fly, then you don't need Real ID. But the problem is going to become, this is going to be sort of a separation, again, creating like a caste system for people who are going to be shut out from certain opportunities, reason why they can't get those documents.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's sometimes if we don't think of that, like that next level, and we can miss some of those, those negative impacts these things can potentially create.
Absolutely. Software solutions is very good to think about the great new thing that you can do, but also you have to really be able to look at the ethics and the potential harms that a particular, software solution or process may put in place, and then understand that there may be some people who are more vulnerable, that it basically doesn't fit their life or their lifestyle, and see how you can find a way to remedy that.
Mm-hmm. I'm keen to hear your thoughts, and, obviously here in Australia, it might not be as well known, but the new privacy laws that are coming into California as of January 2020.
Right. So the CCPA, which is the California Consumer Privacy Act, as you said, is going into force January 1st, 2020. It gives unprecedented rights to consumers in the state of California about how companies use their data and provide levels of transparency, give them an idea about opting out of data sharing. There's a lot of data selling that happens, especially with U.S. data, because there hasn't been any comprehensive consumer privacy laws in the U.S. So there really is a kind of a Wild West mentality in some sense about how data is handled and how it's bought and sold. So this law is really creating a level of transparency, something that's somewhat akin to the GDPR. The CCPA, to give you an idea, it will be the most comprehensive consumer data privacy law in the U.S., and it is somewhat like the GDPR in that both laws have as a foundation that they consider privacy as a fundamental human right and have for decades. But in the U.S., it's different because not all states have that same information in their constitution. So it makes sense that California was kind of the first state to do that. But also, California is a state that other states look to for, their progressive nature in terms of how they regulate different things. So people are concerned because the U.S. doesn't yet have a federal consumer data privacy law, and they feel as though without something imminent that the California rules and regulation will become the de facto rule and regulation on data in the U.S. So it's going to be very interesting, I think, to see what's going to be happening in the U.S. And then also people that I know, especially people in Europe and Asia and South America, they're also looking very closely at the CCPA because if you think about it, a lot of the tech companies are from California, a lot of them. So a lot of their influence is going to go throughout the world, people think. So they're looking very closely at the CCPA, as are we. And we're all kind of waiting to see how things play out with that regulation.
What are some of the kind of big impacts that you expect to see from day one?
I think some of the impacts I expect to see from day one will be more knowledge of consumers about what rights they have or what rights they don't have. So the one big thing about the CCPA, I think, is more awareness, because I think people feel like they have more rights to their data or more access to their data than they actually have. So to be able to see how the CCPA is a juxtaposition against their particular state law or wherever it is they live, to say, hey, I thought when I downloaded this game or when I logged onto the website that that's all that they would do with my data is use it to serve me. But actually, these companies may be actually selling the data to someone else, and that may be something that I didn't know about. And maybe that will help other consumers to ask other companies in other states, hey, what are you doing with my data? I know I don't live in California, but I would like to have the same rights that someone in California would have in terms of having the transparency and it or give it back to me.
Mm-hmm. And do you think we'll see any kind of dramatic changes in, say, some of the big tech companies that are using our data right now? They make a living of selling our data. Do you think there'll be some really big ramifications, or do you think it'll just be kind of business as usual, change the policy? Some people might opt out, but most people will just continue to use it as they have been in the past.
I think the bigger companies, because I feel like they feel as though they have a bigger target on their back, are putting, a lot more effort into making sure they're in compliance. But also I feel as though companies may be trying to dance around the rules a bit in terms of their reading of the law. So, for example, one of the things that the CCPA calls for is transparency in the transfer of data to a third party. This is similar in some ways to the GDPR in terms of onward transfer, but the transfer of someone is selling data is typically handled by data brokers. So let's say a company that was big and had a lot of money could say, instead of me having to tell someone that I'm transferring my data to a data broker, why don't we buy the data broker? So then they don't have to, they can continue the same behavior, but because the data broker is part of their own company, or they can say we have a legitimate interest in doing this because we're part of the same company. So I think we're going to see a lot of collapsing of the data brokerage type companies, or at least how they're categorized, so that they're not seen as third parties, but more integral to a corporation.
Mm-hmm. So it's something I'm really fascinated with this, because working in smart community space or smart city space, and now calling smart community space, and me personally, I'm an engineer. I come from that kind of technical background, but then more looking at community building and now living and breathing this space, privacy and data. I find it really fascinating now how we're going to move, forward in this space, and these new laws coming in, and us as informed citizens, what does that actually mean for us? So I'm so excited to be talking to you about this. So if you don't mind, I'd love to just chat a bit more about some of from your perspective, globally, what are some of the things you've been seeing around the world that are kind of moving in this direction of having more data ownership? I mean, obviously the new laws and that type of thing, but is there any places that you see doing, something different or something new or something innovative in this space?
Well, let's see. I would say right now, the country or the region that has an interesting background in terms of data privacy, they've always had very strong laws around banking and what can go in and out of the country about banking. And they recently decided that they wanted to say that privacy was a fundamental human right, which is the same foundation that's used for the GDPR and the CCPA. But people don't realize perhaps that India has more people in it than the US and Europe combined. So, and it's a really big market for things like smartphones and Internet of Things, because being able to get access to people that may not have had access previously, and being able to, as you know, India is trying to implement a lot of identity systems to make sure that they can identify who is who and who does what and who does banking and things like that. It's really a hot market worldwide for companies. They're pushing a lot of money into India to really be able to capture data there, especially before they pass any super comprehensive laws. So I know at some point the government in India was saying that they were looking at having something maybe not as robust or stringent as GDPR, but not as laissez-faire as they felt the US would be. So that is, I feel like companies are really moving into other countries or regions that aren't as developed on the data privacy regulation spectrum to be able to gather as much data as they can before that happens.
Oh, that's really interesting. And I mean, it's probably a bit of a controversial topic, but there's lots of talk around the world about, tech companies being more powerful than government, and particularly in this data and privacy space. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess it is a controversial topic in some ways, but I think, as I'm looking back at the decade, I probably did not expect or predict that, an application that you use that's free could have so much power and influence over information. So, for example, I think about growing up, we used to read newspapers, or we used to watch the news to figure out what was happening. And now we have people, they get their news from something like Facebook. So, it's a very, very different world in terms of how people operate. So if people are only looking at sort of narrow slivers of ways to get information, is very easy for them possibly to be manipulated because they're not looking at the wider picture or the wider lens. So I feel like sometimes we may customize ourselves or target things entirely too much where we can become obtuse and not really look at the bigger picture of data or what's happening around us.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the key, the key things to consider when we're talking, smart cities, smart communities, when it does come to data? Is there, kind of the 101 that you see around the world that maybe people aren't thinking about enough?
Well, to me, one of the big things that will be, I think, a big issue, it's already started to be an issue, but it probably will be a big issue for the next 10 years or so, will be the use of biometrics in terms of identity and how people access services or systems within smart communities. So things like, how do people open doors, or how do they get into their office buildings, or where they go on the weekend, or how fast they drive. All this information is being accumulated and is being woven together, but there's no guarantee. We hope that all this information be used for good, but maybe not. So we have to really understand or contemplate the potential harms or abuse to this type of data gathering and sort of knitting together. But, that doesn't mean that we need to stop innovating or moving forward in terms of how we look at how to make smart cities better. But we also have to look at ways to sort of stop or minimize or eliminate or even mitigate the possibility of abuse, and understand the harm of people who are maybe not like us, or people who are more in diverse communities. So all that has to be understood. So I think, especially when you think about business, from a business perspective, businesses have target customers, but from a government perspective, their charge is to serve the entire community. So there are technologies and systems that only some people in the community can access and not others. That will be a big challenge, I think, for smart cities and technology people, because you do have to find a way for everyone to access the system to be able to sort of live in the community the best way that they can.
Yeah, no, that is so important. And I guess, sorry, I haven't actually asked you any of the questions I intended to, but I found your conversation so interesting. Let's go to some of the projects and things that you're currently working on at the moment.
I'm working a lot with companies that are looking to find better tools to deal with data privacy, whether they be companies that are looking to buy or invest in technology, or merge with companies, or even companies that are saying, this is the best solution for me for handling our data privacy needs. Software or tools or services having to do specifically with data privacy. It's going to be interesting to see in the next few years who is kind of, the top of the hill, basically, in these technologies, and, who doesn't make it in this area. Because there are so many different types of needs, and not every tool is, there's no magic bullet and there's no magic button. There's no one tool to rule them all currently, and maybe there never will be. So I think right now I'm just helping clients and investment groups navigate sort of this new world of data privacy and regulation, and what that means, or how that impacts their business in terms of serving customers, but then their business in terms of what makes sense to support and invest in the future.
And obviously you have to do a lot of kind of integration across different disciplines, government and industry. How do you think we can do that integration piece a bit better?
I think, there has to be some data sharing. So businesses, a lot of times when they're finding problems, let's say for cybersecurity or data breach incidents, this is something that everyone in the world is dealing with, who is dealing with data systems. So the type of sharing that would typically happen in a private corporation, it likely wouldn't happen. because maybe some people felt as though their solution to the problem is kind of a differentiator for them some way in the market. But because data breaches and hacking is so prevalent, there has to be a meeting of the minds where people can come together and talk about the problems, talk about, the issues that people are having with ransomware, so that they can really be able to sort of combat the issue. I feel as though a lot of the hacking incidents and ransomware incidents that we're seeing around the world, they tend to be people going from company to company doing a lot of the same things. So I feel as though if someone, had the misfortune to have experienced this type of thing, it's really incumbent upon them, not just within their company, but just for everyone to be able to sort of share that in some way that can help the next business or the next government or the next school. There was a stat that came up recently that said there were several thousand school systems within the last 12 months who have been hit with ransomware, and that should terrify anyone. But I feel like a lot of private corporations that have money, they may be dealing with the same issues. So being able to sort of share that information or that knowledge with people on a municipal level who aren't for-profit businesses, so to speak, will really help companies or help cities be able to grow and really mitigate those risks.
So what do you think the emerging trends are that people aren't talking about enough?
I think one of the emerging trends that people are not talking about enough is probably dealing with the prevalence of biometric data. So in terms of how people use your voice, your likeness, your fingerprints, your face, all those types of things to create kind of identity systems or to create ways to identify you and how you sort of run your life and, do things in your life and your business. So it can be frightening because if someone were, let's say, someone were to breach your password, you could change your password, you could change your service, but you can't change your fingerprint, you can't change your face, sort of you are as a person. So being able to find ways to really secure people's, true identity is going to be a huge crisis, because what's to say that someone were to have enough information about you to imitate you in a way that you couldn't even, they could lock you out of your own life, literally. So to me, this is a really big issue that people aren't aware that could be, a lot worse than a missing password or a checking account where money is taken out of. We're talking about people literally could be almost like a double of you in the digital world. It's a huge problem that people aren't really seeing in full focus right now, but probably will in the near future.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said in that space. We kind of just take it like second nature that we'll use facial recognition, and people ask me about it a lot as well. And it's something that concerns me of like what in the back end, who actually has access to that and, my face, your face. But then, if they can link that then to other details, what does that mean for us?
Right. I agree with that. It is very concerning. And I think there are smart people right now that are working on solutions to really answer that question, because they really understand how dangerous it can be. For example, when he's wearing like a hoodie or something, and maybe like the worst person in your company may be, someone's grandma that has her password on a post-it note or something, because that could be an easy way to sort of breach or get into a system. But then also, depending on how systems are authenticating people, they could be creating accounts in your name and doing things that you wouldn't typically do, but they're more you than you in some ways.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting moving forward. And particularly, these incidents of hacking and like in local governments, is it happening more and more, or is it just that we're hearing about it more and more?
I think maybe both. I think it's happening more and more, and I think we're hearing about it more and more, and I hope that people don't get desensitized to it, because seems like every day we're hearing about a new incident or several companies having the same incident over and over. Municipalities and organizations that are not as well funded have a particular challenge in this area because they may not have the money like, other bigger corporations, even though they're not immune either. Even some of the biggest corporations in the world are having the same type of issues. But I think the success of things like ransomware or being able to have people pay ransom because they're afraid that they may go out of business is a huge issue, or they may not be able to serve, their community. Like, for example, let's say there was a system, and this happened in the U.S. recently, where there was a nursing home system that was, they had a ransomware attack, and they thought, we don't pay these people money, people are going to die because we can't access the medication records for people. We don't know what operations they need to have. And they were like really concerned about the risk of people who are, very vulnerable. So I think that that's going to continue to happen, especially if there isn't enough information sharing between the public and the private sector, and more information about how to prevent that in the future for sort of all types of organizations.
Well, Debbie, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. I've really enjoyed our conversation, so I really appreciate it.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much, Zoe.
I just have one last question, which is how can people connect with you?
Okay, people can connect with me by reaching me at my website, which is www.debbiereynoldsconsulting.com.
Excellent. Thank you again for coming onto the podcast. And yeah, I really want to have another conversation, so I look forward to that.
Perfect. I would love to. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Talk soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.
The Smart Community Podcast is brought to you by My Smart Community. If you're trying to deal with disruption, not sure what technologies to buy, need to facilitate genuine collaboration, then we can help. Email hello@mysmart.community or head to www.mysmart.community/consulting.
Thanks so much for listening to the Smart Community Podcast. Show notes for this episode and all other episodes are available on our website, mysmart.community/podcast. If you have any questions for us or any of our guests, you can email hello@mysmart.community. You can also find us on the socials. We are on LinkedIn and Twitter @SmartComHQ. That's com with 2 M's. If you are enjoying the podcast, please hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. And we would love for you to leave us a rating and review at wherever you listen. This really helps us reach more ears and eyes, so thank you for your support. As always, we hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.